Okay, why don't we get going? Um, Good evening, everyone, and thank you for taking the time to join us for our Sienna-wide resident and family town hall. I'm Maureen Hart. I work with Sienna, and I'm here to host this evening and introduce our guests and help take up your questions. It's been a while since we've held one of these town halls, but as we get closer to the cooler months of the year and prepare not only for flu season, but COVID and other viruses, we wanted to ensure you had all the information you need to support your loved ones. We did ask for some questions in advance and have attempted to answer some of them through the content that will be presented, and others will be asked at the end of the presentations. And as well, as always, you can write other questions in the chat at any time, and we'll take those up later in the meeting. Please remember that due to privacy, we can't answer questions about specific individuals. And if you do have questions about your loved one's health and the vaccines, we ask you to please bring those forward to your community team or to your physician. Now I'd like to introduce our guests for this evening. We're joined by Dr. Allison McGeer, Chief Infection Prevention and Control Consultant to Sienna. Dr. McGeer is the premier infection prevention and control specialist in Canada, a professor at the University of Toronto, and she advises multiple levels of government on pandemic prevention and management. You may have seen Dr. McGeer interviewed on the news in relation to the COVID-19 pandemic, and with Sienna, she has played an important role in guiding our teams to effectively manage the pandemic and related outbreaks, as well as preparing sustainable plans for ongoing management of various viruses that society faces today. We're also pleased to have Marcus Rupchan, who is the Infection Prevention and Control Partner at Sienna, and will provide us with an overview of the processes we have in place to manage vaccinations and maintain the health and safety within our communities. So now I would like to turn things over to Dr. McGeer to begin with her presentation. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Maureen, and welcome everybody. I hope you got to enjoy a little bit of the summer and that getting back to school and work is settling in nicely. This is, of course, the time of year when we start to think about preparing for the winter respiratory virus season in healthcare, including long-term care and retirement homes across the country. And this year's a little different than previous years have been, because this year suddenly we're up to 4 new vaccines, or 3 new vaccines and 1 old one. And that just seems somehow fundamentally different and more challenging, I think, for all of us to think about getting all of those vaccines and how we're going to manage them. So I wanted to spend a little time talking about why those vaccines have come and where they've come from, and what you need to know about those vaccines and how operations regarding those vaccines are going to work at Sienna. So let's start by talking about why we care about preventing illness due to respiratory viruses and the bacteria that cause respiratory illness. Respiratory infections, including pneumonia, are the 3rd leading cause of death in Canada at the moment. So much less common as a cause of death than cancer of heart disease, but still an important cause of death, and now substantially a preventable cause of death. It's not just that people die from these infections, it's also that even in young adults, recovery from an episode of pneumonia, no matter what it's caused by, can take weeks and weeks. And the older and frailer you are, the harder it is to recover, the longer it takes. And often recovery in frail older adults is incomplete and leaves people with poorer functional status than they had before. So we really want to prevent these infections from happening. In addition, all of these infections, whether because of the inflammation or because of the stress on the body, trigger heart attacks and strokes, again, events that we would like to avoid. And in long-term care and retirement homes, they cause outbreaks. So in addition to the regular risks that people have in the community, there's a particular additional risk to being in long-term care. But like different kinds of cancers, pneumonia can be caused by many different viruses and bacteria. And so here are the top 4 causes of pneumonia, respiratory tract infections in Canada at the moment. COVID-19, even though we'd all really like it to be over, is definitively not over, still causing even more disease than influenza, which before COVID, influenza was the most common cause of death among any infections across Canada, but it's now beaten out by COVID. In the last 3 months in Canada, according to Health Canada statistics, 924 people have died of COVID-19. So we'd like to be finished with it, but it's not finished with us yet. So COVID-19 still the top, followed by influenza, and then RSV, short for respiratory syncytial virus, another influenza-like virus, and a bacteria called the pneumococcus or streptococcus pneumonia are the next 2 in line of big burden. And it turns out that this year, for the first time, we have access to vaccines against all of these infections in Canada. So this is like new and different. And we all have to think about how we're going to manage this and how we're going to manage the vaccine programs going with them. So for the next few minutes, I'm going to talk through each of these vaccines, about how long the vaccine has been around, what it's preventing, and what you need to know about the vaccines. Next slide. I'm going to do them in the order of how long we've had these vaccines. So influenza vaccines were actually developed during the Second World War, very quickly after the discovery of viruses in 1938, to protect soldiers, because influenza caused such damage in outbreaks in military barracks during the war. And the first broad population campaign started in 1945. As you know, there are 3 kinds of human influenza: AH1N1, AH3N2, and B. And each of these different types of viruses evolve and change every year. So we need a new vaccine every year to keep up with changes in the vaccines. Influenza vaccines are frustratingly not as effective as we would like. They prevent, on average, in older adults, about 30% of infections and somewhere between 40 and 70% of severe infections. It would be wonderful to have better vaccines. But in the meantime, it's really important to recognize that what we have is a lot better than nothing. Prevention is never perfect, and while influenza vaccine is much less than perfect, it still prevents a very significant amount of illness and death across Canada. All the way across Canada now, there are 2 vaccines that are specifically recommended for older adults, both of them that give you a better immune response than the standard influenza vaccine. One of them is called the high-dose vaccine, contains 4 times the antigen content. Can't spell, can I, Maureen? Sorry. That's content, not consent. 4 times the antigen content that standard dose does. So you get an exposure to more antigen, you make more antibody. The second one is adjuvanted. The adjuvanted vaccine contains the same amount of antigen, but it has a local immune stimulant with it. So when you get it injected into your arm, that local immune stimulant encourages the immune response around where the vaccine is injected, and again gives you a better immune response to the vaccine than regular vaccine does. And both of those vaccines work better than regular vaccines and seem to be about the same. So different provinces are using different mixes of high dose and adjuvanted vaccines. They're both a little better for older adults than regular vaccines. Next slide. So always you want to know about who should not receive vaccines. People spend a great deal of time purifying vaccines, reducing the number of components in them, working on making them safe for everybody, because of course the whole point of something preventive is that anybody can take it. But there are still always a few people for whom any particular vaccine might be a problem. And you'll notice this as we come to it recurrently. Anybody who's had a serious allergic reaction to a specific influenza vaccine should not have that vaccine again, or an allergic reaction to the components of the vaccine, with the exception of egg. We used to worry about egg protein because influenza vaccines are generally start by growing the virus in eggs. But we've learned over time that egg protein is completely removed from the vaccine, so you don't have to worry about it. You do have to worry about other components, though, and adjuvanted vaccines may still contain traces of two relatively uncommon antibiotics. If you're allergic to them, you should not have those vaccines. The second group of people who should perhaps not get an influenza vaccine is people who have developed a neurologic condition called Guillain-Barré syndrome within 6 weeks of a previous influenza vaccine. And here, NACI, our National Advisory Committee on Immunization, recommends that you have to balance the risk of influenza against the risk of a recurrent episode of Guillain-Barré syndrome, and that should be done, obviously, between an individual and their healthcare provider. Next slide. Obviously, we worry about short-term side effects of vaccines as well, and influenza vaccines reliably cause a little bit of a sore arm. So usually 30 to 40% of people will get some kind of sore arm after the vaccine. It's useful to remember that you don't have to suffer through the sore arm. You can take something for pain. It's not going to reduce the effectiveness of the vaccine. With standard dose vaccine, there are no systemic reactions associated with it. People do sometimes complain of feeling ill after they get a vaccine, and that's a problem with the fact that we administer vaccines in October and November. In October and November, there are lots of other respiratory viruses around, and you can get sick anytime. So lots of people think they get the flu from the flu vaccine. But big randomized controlled trials have in fact shown that when you get the flu vaccine, if you had a randomized controlled trial where half of people get placebo and half of people get flu vaccine, fever, fatigue, muscle aches, headaches are exactly the same rate in people who get placebo and people who get the influenza vaccine. It's just there's a lot of other illness circulating at the time you get your influenza vaccine, and some people will get sick. With high dose or adjuvanted vaccine, right, those are stronger vaccines, a small number of people, the estimate is 1 or 2 in every 100 people, may have some fever, achiness, and mild fever for a day or two after they take the vaccine. Next slide. Okay, so that's influenza vaccine, and in general, we're, I think, all comfortable with it and comfortable with the shift to stronger vaccines for older adults. Next on our list is the pneumococcus, a bacteria called Streptococcus pneumonia. We've had vaccines for this since 1983. It is the most common cause of bacterial pneumonia, right? We were talking about viral pneumonia with influenza. Now we're talking about bacterial pneumonia. And this particular bacteria has many different serotypes. The serotypes are names for the surface coating, and that's what our immune system responds to. The old version of the vaccine we've been using for adults for more than 40 years, but it didn't work in children under the age of 2, and children also have very high risks of pneumococcal disease. So people developed a new vaccine called the conjugate vaccine, works better in children. Turns out that the conjugate vaccine also works a little bit better in adults, and the effect lasts for longer in adults. So when we first had these vaccines for children in 1997, the vaccine was called PCV7, so pneumococcal conjugate vaccine, because it had 7 serotypes. And that wasn't a good choice for adults because we had a version that had 23 serotypes in it. We were okay. But now we've gotten up to PCV20, so there's 20 serotypes in it. And so now we have a vaccine that's actually better for adults than the old vaccine. It works a little bit better in the short term, and it lasts significantly longer. And just this year, NACI has recommended this vaccine for all adults who are 65 and older. And most provinces are now incorporating vaccines. I'm not sure that BC has announced their decision yet, but I have been told that provinces across the country are moving to include older adults. So it should be coming in the next few months. Next slide. Again, always need to know who can't receive vaccines. And so people who've had an allergic reaction after previous administration of the vaccine or have an hypersensitivity to the component of the vaccine called polysorbate 80. Polysorbate 80 is related to polyethylene glycol. Polyethylene glycol is a compound that's in lots of creams and makeup and other things that we use regularly. It's really uncommon to be allergic to it, but people can be. And those people need to be careful. Next slide. Okay. Now, SARS, now we're into the newer vaccines. SARS-CoV-2, as you know, was a vaccine that was first used at the very end of 2020 and the beginning of 2021 in response to COVID-19. And gradually over time, we've had both multiple vaccine doses and infections. And that's changed this virus from something that was really dangerous. The first time that people met COVID-19, their immune systems had never seen this virus before. It took time to respond to it, and there were lots of people who got seriously ill with it. That effect has gradually reduced as we become more familiar with the virus and our immune systems have been trained on the vaccines and our previous infections. But still, there are two problems with COVID. The first is there's still lots of serious disease and death going on that we'd like it not to be. And so many people have wanted to close their eyes to it, but we do still need to be worried about preventing it, even though it's clearly not nearly as much of a threat as it was before. The second problem with SARS-CoV-2 is that this virus evolves and changes over time. And so, like the influenza virus, this is a virus that you're going to need to keep up with in your vaccines. Next slide. So, what the National Advisory Committee on Immunization recommends for this winter is that this list of Canadians should be getting a dose of the updated vaccines, either a JN1 vaccine if it's the protein vaccine made by Novavax, or KP2 vaccine if it's made by Moderna or Pfizer. So all residents of long-term care or other congregate living settings, people over the age of 65, people with underlying medical conditions, pregnant individuals, individuals from Indigenous communities, members of racialized or other equity-deserving communities. Those people are not at higher risk genetically, obviously, but they are at higher risk because of the systemic racism and the inequities associated with living in those communities, and therefore need additional protection. And then people who provide essential community services so that we don't suffer from absenteeism if there's a spike of virus activity in the winter. Everybody else is now in the category of, if you wish to be protected against COVID, that's fine. You may receive a dose of the updated vaccine, but it's not in the, no longer is strongly recommended by NACI. It's just recommended. Next slide. Okay. So there's been a lot of discussion about how far the COVID vaccines are separated now from the viruses that are causing infection, and whether your XBB 1.5 vaccine that you might have got last spring is still going to protect you against JN1 and KP2 and KP3 this fall. I'm going to show you two different ways of looking at what the relationship between these viruses are and why NACI is recommending that we all get an updated vaccine. So this gray structure with the colors on it is a model of the spike protein. That's the main protein on the surface of the virus that is responsible for binding to the cells of your respiratory tract and for generating an immune response. And on the right-hand side, you see all of these little rectangular labels. Those rectangular labels mark the places where amino acids in this protein, so the single elements of the protein, are different between XBB.1.5 and JN1. There's 48 of them, and all of those differences make the protein a different shape and mean that your immune response is not as good against JN1 if you had a vaccine that was built towards XBB.1.5. When you look at the difference between JN1 and KP2 and KP3, which are the three of them, you see that between JN1 and KP2, there's only 2 amino acids that are different. And they haven't shown it here, but the bottom 2 little rectangles are the differences between JN1 and KP3. So these viruses are really closely related to each other, and whichever vaccine you get, whether it's a JN1 or KP2, is going to get all of the viruses that are currently active. So it really is important this fall to get the updated vaccine. Next slide. Here's another way of looking at it. This is called antigenic cartography. It's an antigenic map, and each one of these squares in both left to right and top to bottom marks a twofold difference in antibody response to a vaccine. So down in the bottom, the D614G is the original COVID virus, and you can see that its antigen has changed to BA1 and BA2, and then up to BA5, and then a really broad range in the top left corner of XBB.1.5 vaccines. But in the meantime, the virus has been evolving off in a different direction to this cluster that is JN1 and KP3 and KP2. So again, showing you that there's this really significant difference in how your immune system responds to XBB.1.5 and JN1, KP2, and KP3, which are over in a cluster. So you both need a new vaccine, but whatever new vaccine you get is going to cover these new variants. Next slide. And this graph just shows you the extent of the difference. So this is a World Health Organization slide of the protective efficacy of an XBB.1.5 vaccine against XBB.1.5 and against JN1. Each of these little blue bars tells you the protection against different kinds of disease, hospitalization, symptomatic disease, and infection with XBB.1.5. And you can see against hospitalization, the vaccine's about 75% effective. Against JN1, though, the protection of an XBB.1.5 vaccine drops down to about 40%. So our leftover XBB1 vaccines, whether we got them in February or whether we got them in July or August, are not going to protect us well against JN1. We need updated vaccines this fall. Next slide. Okay. Now, one of the challenges with COVID-19 vaccines that's associated with all of the mRNA vaccines, but also with even the adjuvanted protein vaccine that Novavax makes, is that these vaccines are what's called more reactogenic than influenza vaccines. And this slide shows you the difference. This is in a large group of people in Israel comparing symptoms after COVID-19 vaccines in the green bars and after influenza vaccine in the orange bars. You can see that nearly 70% of people who got an influenza vaccine had no arm pain, no systemic symptoms, nothing. But it's only 40% of COVID vaccine people who didn't have some issue after their vaccine. Most commonly, just not feeling well, weak, muscle aches, headache, and then in 6 or 7 out of 100 people, fever or chills. So you do get symptoms after COVID vaccine that you don't get after influenza vaccine or pneumococcal vaccine. And in the blue bar, the blue boxes on the right, you can see that about 10% of people who got the COVID vaccine, including 6% of people who had no reaction to an influenza vaccine, had at least one severe symptom for 1 day. Now, it does help a little bit if you look at the next slide to know how long these symptoms are likely to last. So these are the most common local events: pain, swelling, and redness after COVID vaccines, and then fever, headache, and muscle aches, myalgias, muscle aches in the systemic events. And you can see that in this particular study, about 1 in 3 people got some muscle aches afterwards, most of them mild. I'm sorry, I've lost the blue is mild, the yellow is moderate, the red is severe. So most of the muscle aches are relatively mild, and they lasted for 2 or 3 days. So reliably, these go away, but it can be for a few days that you don't feel well after you get the COVID vaccine. Next slide. Okay, again, who should not receive a vaccine? Here we come back to the same thing. People who've had a serious allergic reaction after previous administration, people who have a serious hypersensitivity to any component of the vaccines, and the mRNA vaccines contain polyethylene glycol and trimethoprim, and Novavax contains polysorbate 80. Again, not common allergies to have, but can occur. And for the mRNA vaccines in particular, but also for the protein vaccine, history of myocarditis after a dose of COVID-19 vaccine. That has predominantly happened in young men, but it has occasionally happened in other people. Next slide. Now, there are a few things that are different about the National Advisory Committee on Immunization's recommendations about COVID vaccines this fall. The first is that there's a switch from thinking about how long it's been since you got a previous vaccine dose before you get this fall vaccine dose. We've all been operating on, generally speaking, you should have a 6-month gap between when you get one vaccine dose and when you get the next one. But NACI has said specifically that they want the minimum this fall to be 3 months, and that if you're more than 3 months, you should be getting the fall vaccine dose. And that is about sort of shifting our timing so that we're getting into more of a routine with COVID-19 vaccine doses, and so that we simplify when people are thinking about getting their vaccine doses, they don't forget them, or they don't get missed for some reason when they come up. So in order to try to make sure that everybody can get an updated dose of vaccine this fall, NACI has said you only need to wait 3 months from a previous vaccine to get this fall's dose. The second thing that NACI has said is that you don't no longer have to think about how long ago it was that you got COVID before you get a new dose of the vaccine. And that substantially is because we're no longer doing testing for viral infections. The reason for that is when we were in the middle of COVID, all of us were taking pretty extreme precautions to prevent the spread of COVID, and most other viruses weren't circulating. So when you did a test, if you got a respiratory illness, there was a good chance it was COVID, and it made sense to do a COVID test. But now we're back to regular times, and there are literally hundreds of respiratory viruses, and you can have any of them. And so if you have something and you do a test, the chances are, in general, less than 10% that you're going to be positive for COVID. So then it becomes not very efficient or effective to be testing for COVID, or for that matter, testing for flu in the general setting. And that, of course, means that you can't tell whether you've had COVID, and so you can no longer take it into consideration. You just have to be able to stop worrying about it. This is, of course, what we do with other respiratory viruses all the time, just we're not used to doing it with COVID. That doesn't mean that if you recently had COVID, you might say, well, I'm going to skip this dose of the COVID vaccine because having an infection with COVID has about the same effect as having a dose of COVID vaccine. So it's not that people shouldn't necessarily think about it if they've had a positive test for COVID. It's just that you don't have to worry about it anymore. And the third thing that's different this fall is that NACI has said that you can get your COVID vaccine at the same time as, or at any time before or after, any other vaccine. And that's just I was just waiting for enough studies of different kinds of vaccines given at the same time as a COVID vaccine to make sure that you got the same response and you didn't get significantly more adverse events if you got two vaccines at one time than if you got one vaccine. Again, that is to make it easier for all of us to get the vaccines that we need at any given time in the fall. Next slide. Okay, and then lastly, respiratory syncytial virus. This is a brand new vaccine, but it's actually been a vaccine that people have been working on for more than 50 years. And one of the interesting academic things about the COVID pandemic was that it was because of the development of RSV vaccines and where we were that we actually got COVID vaccines so quickly, because the structure of what's called the F protein in RSV and the spike protein in SARS-CoV-2 are very similar, and people could immediately see the parallels between the two. And so they knew what they had to do in order to make vaccines for COVID. So RSV vaccines have been a long time in development, but they're here now. And RSV is a virus like influenza in the sense that it causes respiratory tract infections, that it can trigger heart attacks and strokes. It's different from influenza in that relative to influenza, it's a somewhat lower burden, and it's shifted towards older and frailer adults than influenza is. The next difference about RSV and influenza and COVID is that we don't have any treatments for RSV infections. You get influenza, or if you're in an influenza outbreak, we have preventive medication and we have treatment medication that you can get. We have some treatment for COVID-19. We don't have treatment for RSV. So this is a piece of why we've been so keen to get RSV vaccines out to protect people from this infection. Next slide. There are currently two RSV vaccines that are authorized in Canada, one of them made by GlaxoSmithKline and GSK, and one of them made by Pfizer. They both use what's called the prefusion F protein, that protein that sticks out on the surface. GSK vaccine has no adjuvant in it, and as a consequence is associated, as you can see, with less risk of a sore arm after you get the vaccine and less risk of systemic symptoms. In Ontario, is publicly funded for people who live in long-term care and retirement homes if they're over 60. The Pfizer vaccine is not currently being used in public campaigns across the country. If people have private insurance plans, a number of the private insurance plans do cover one of these vaccines, so it's worth asking. And if people can afford it, there's a good reason for getting these vaccines if you live in long-term care or in congregate living settings. Hopefully, the price of these vaccines will come down and we will be able to move them into public programs in the next couple of years. Next slide. Now, RSV does not change nearly as quickly as influenza or COVID-19. And so we don't know how long a dose of the RSV vaccine is going to last. So this slide shows you the efficacy of the GSK vaccine, just because that's the only one we're actually using in Canada in public systems. And you can see that across all of the different outcomes, this vaccine is holding up at 2 years after initial doses were out. So we're still waiting to see whether this vaccine is going to last 2 years or 3 years or 5 years. But the moment, if you get this vaccine, it's one dose, it's at least 2 years, and it may be significantly longer. Next slide. So the National Advisory Committee on Immunization has just recently recommended that adults who are 75 years of age and older, adults who are 60 years of age and older who are residents of long-term care homes or other chronic care facilities should be getting a dose of this vaccine. The reason for the lower age and people living in long-term care or chronic care is both because those people tend to be frailer than other adults who live in the community, but also because the congregate living setting makes transmission of viruses easier, and RSV, like influenza, causes outbreaks in long-term care. And so we want to offer more protection to people who live in congregate settings. And then younger adults may wish to, 60 to 74 years, who have conditions that put them at high risk, might wish to get this vaccine. How quickly we'll get this into public programs, as I said, is still unknown. Next slide. Again, when should you not get a vaccine? Both of these vaccines contain polysorbate 80. Obviously, people haven't had these vaccines yet, so nobody's had an anaphylactic reaction yet. But if you are allergic to polyethylene glycol or polysorbate 80, that's something you need to know about not getting the vaccine. Next slide. Okay, and I just want to point out here for a moment, because again, we get back to this just feels like a lot, right? All of these vaccines at once, when, 4 years ago, you just got your flu vaccine in the fall and there wasn't anything to worry about. So a couple of things about this. The first is that it looks like COVID and flu vaccines are likely going to be annual for a while, and hopefully we're going to get one vaccine that has both of them in it in a couple of years, but we're not there yet. The pneumococcal vaccine and the RSV vaccines are vaccines at the moment that you get once and see. So it's not like we're recommending that you get all of these vaccines at the same time. You can get the RSV vaccine at any time. The pneumococcal vaccine is not yet available in public programs, but it's coming up soon. So in general, we're going to be focused on getting COVID and flu vaccines given to people together. But I just wanted, this was a data presented by the Centers for Disease Control about Americans getting combined vaccines. So there's two things I think to think about with getting more than one vaccine at the same time. The first is, if you look at this, there were 943,000 Americans who got an RSV vaccine, a flu vaccine, and a COVID vaccine at the same time in their pharmacy last year, okay? No muss, no fuss, none of us heard about it, okay? But huge numbers of people getting 3 vaccines. It's safe, it's effective, just a question of getting used to it. The second thing to think about is that your children and grandchildren, right, at the age of 2, 4, and 6 months, they also get 3 injections, and for very good reason, because they're being protected against diseases that cause significant morbidity for those children. So getting multiple vaccines is new for us older adults, but it's not new and different in kids or in other people. And so a piece of this adjustment to multiple vaccines is just thinking our way through it and getting used to it. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Marcus to talk about the operationalizing this at Sienna.
Thank you so much, Dr. McGeer, for, again, a very informative, engaging presentation. So hello, everyone. For this part of the presentation, I will go over the Sienna practices regarding the vaccine process and what that kind of looks like as well. So next slide. Thank you. So resident immunization process. So in terms of resident immunization process, we do ensure annual consents are being maintained and completed on a yearly basis. And this is to ensure we have the most up-to-date information regarding the consent. So let's say if a resident and or substitute decision maker does decide to decline the vaccine, what happens next? So we will respect that decision, but we'll still provide information about the importance of the vaccine to support an informed choice as well. So in terms of the vaccine administration dates, this will be coordinated with the different local public health units and with the different campaigns that is occurring at that time. Next slide. So consent process for vaccination. So the consent process for vaccination will be completed in different channels of communications, like emails that will have information regarding the vaccine, phone calls, and in-person conversation can be arranged as well if preferred. And there will be posters around the care community containing information about the different vaccines. And as well as mentioned earlier, annual consents will be completed to have the most updated information regarding the consent of the vaccine. Next slide. So managing vaccine compliance and monitoring post-vaccination. So we will always respect resident choice if they want to decline the vaccine. This will be documented in their health record information accordingly. As well, we will still provide that ongoing education to empower residents and families about their choices and ensure that they are making informed decisions. Another aspect we view is the monitoring of residents. So monitoring of residents is something that we're always occurring every day, but we do ensure we monitor them for any immediate reaction. And if they had a previous reaction before from the vaccine, we'll take additional steps to ensure that the resident is safe. Next slide. So how do we keep our community safe? So again, as we approach the respiratory season, it's crucial that we all come together as a community. The reality is we are all part of the same team. We all have one shared goal, and that's again to protect our resident, protect our staff, protect all of you from infection, and as well just ensure that the community that we're in, it is safe from all of these infections that's kind of circulating around as well. Right. And how do we do this? We do this by hand hygiene. Again, really emphasizing the frequency of hand hygiene for that 15 to 20 seconds, staying up to date with immunization, practicing good respiratory etiquette. And again, please stay at home if you are sick as well. Next slide. Yeah. And we'll turn it over to Maureen for questions.
Great, thank you very much. The first question that we have in the chat here is from Taryn asking about Moderna as a COVID vaccine. She's wondering if that is still being used or is there a different name for it?
Yeah, yes, it's still being used. So one of the interesting things about this evolution of vaccines and all the new vaccines is our naming of them is not as good as it might be. So we will have 3 vaccines against COVID this fall, same as we had last fall. One of them made by Moderna, its brand name is called Spikevax. One of them made by Pfizer, its brand name is Comirnaty, and one of them made by the protein one is made by Novavax. The 2 mRNA vaccines have a KP2 antigen in them. The protein vaccine has a JN1 antigen in them. But otherwise, as they have been in previous years, they're really similar vaccines. And so we've had a little bit of difficulty. We don't want to use brand names for vaccines, but we don't actually have a naming system for generic versions of vaccines yet. Hopefully it's going to come soon. So yeah, it's sometimes really difficult to sort out who's making which vaccine.
Okay, thank you. So some previous questions that were submitted include, one is asking if residents will receive all 3 vaccines at the same time. Is that how it's going to work, Marcus?
Yeah, and similar to what Dr. McGeer nudged on earlier. So you can get all 3 vaccines all at the same time. It is relatively safe as well. But in terms of logistics, we do try to kind of space it out. Maybe there will be 2 vaccines one time and then another kind of follow-up vaccine afterwards. And especially with RSV vaccine, if a loved one did receive that vaccine, it is good for 2 years. So if your loved one did receive that vaccine, they won't be receiving it again for this upcoming season as well.
And when does the vaccine process start this year?
Yeah, so the vaccine process would be starting off right now in terms of obtaining consents, reaching out to substitute decision makers. In terms of when care communities will be receiving the vaccines will be hopefully later in September, early October. And once we do have it on site, there will be communication to family members and substitute decision makers as well.
Okay, great. Thank you. And Dr. McGeer, what is your advice for people in terms of testing? Because those tests are not always readily available like they used to be. So if people are feeling some symptoms, what should they do?
So it's kind of good news and bad news. It feels as the tests are not available, as if we're missing important information. But in truth, now that we're back into usual activities, there are literally hundreds of viruses around. And so when you get a cold or an upper respiratory tract infection, even if you had a test for COVID and flu, it's very unlikely that it would be positive. And so it's really not a good use of money to be doing tests frequently or to have public health funding tests frequently. So now our advice has gone back to what it has been before, which is that if you get a respiratory tract illness, if you can, you should stay home and stay away from other people so that you don't transmit the virus to other people. If you need to go out and do something, then you should wear a mask, because one of the things we learned during the COVID pandemic is that masks really do work to reduce transmission between people. And most respiratory viruses are most infectious just as you're getting symptoms and in the first day or two of symptoms. So once your fever's been gone for a day, or once you're feeling symptomatically better, then you can go out and not worry about transmitting the infection to other people. So I think we've gone back to what public health told us to do before, and we kind of ignored public health a lot of the time before about transmitting respiratory viruses, because work and other things always seem more important than respiratory viruses. But of course, the truth is they're not, especially for those of us who work in healthcare or in long-term care. And so this is really about going back to what we should have been doing before, to try to protect the vulnerable people that are around us in society.
Okay, great. And one last question. If one of the residents has already had any one of the three viruses we've talked about, do they still need to get the vaccines?
So the answer is, it depends which one. So with influenza always comes in the winter and it changes every year. So last year's influenza infection is like last year's influenza vaccine. It's out of date. Doesn't help, and you just need the new influenza virus every year. For RSV, we don't, RSV reinfections occur fairly frequently, and they may not protect you all that well. There's also RSV-A and RSV-B, and you don't know which one you've had. So our recommendation is very clear that no matter whether you've recently had an RSV infection or not, you should get the RSV vaccine, because it will provide you with better protection. COVID is different again. If you've recently had COVID, there's no problem with getting a vaccine, and getting a vaccine on top of COVID will boost your immune response even further and give you better protection. But you don't necessarily need to get a vaccine dose as much if you've had an infection within the last 3 months. So people who have recently had COVID can think about what they want to do. It's a trade-off between, if you get a vaccine now after you were infected 2 or 3 months ago, you'll get a better response. You'll have better protection in the short term, but maybe you won't have quite as good protection in December and January. If you choose not to get your vaccine now, then you may not be as well protected in November and December, but then you can get a dose of vaccine and be better protected. But you also need to think about one of the problems of skipping doses of vaccines and thinking you'll have them later is that we tend to forget, right? So it's easier to kind of have a rule about when everybody's getting their vaccine and to remember everybody. And so one of the things you do sort of need to accommodate for is that if you choose not to get a vaccine dose with the regular fall campaign in October or November, there's a risk that you and your physician and your caregivers will forget that you really want to get a dose in December.
Okay, great. Well, that brings us to the end of the questions and the end of our time. So I wanted to thank Marcus and Dr. McGeer for joining us tonight and providing all of this valuable information to help all of you be informed, not only for your own benefit, but for your loved ones as well. And we wish you all the best in the coming months and hope that you stay healthy and safe. And have a good rest of your evening. And thanks again for joining us.
Take care.
Good night, everybody.